Ahoy, mateys! Welcome to Podcasts of the Caribbean, a podcast covering the world of Pirates of the Caribbean, from the theme parks to the movies and everything in between. My name is Justin Helmer, and I will be your host on this voyage through the Caribbean. It'd be too late to alter course now, mateys. Hello and welcome back to Podcasts of the Caribbean. This is episode 37, and today we are beginning a new adventure as we start to cover the next big storyline in the Young Jack Sparrow series, and that all starts in Book 5, The Age of Bronze, which is what we're covering today, if you couldn't tell by the title of the episode. So if you haven't listened to the past 4 episodes covering the first 4 books in the series, you can do that so you're caught up with the whole story. But since this book is the start of the next story arc, it's a great place to dive right in if you are completely new to the series. So for a brief recap, the last book, The Sword of Cortez, ended with Jack Sparrow and his crew finally defeating the spirit of Hernan Cortez, and they gave the Sword of Cortez to Tiadama. And now Tiadama warned them at the end that the Sword of Cortez was not the only curse Cortez left behind. But with this next story arc, we won't be dealing with Cortez. We'll be dealing with some new magic and curses, as we'll come to find out in this episode. And after that book, Tumen asked Jack if they could take him back home to the Yucatan. So that is where this book begins. So let's dive right into it. Here is Book 5, The Age of Bronze. So as I said just a moment ago, this book begins with the crew of the Barnacle on their way to the Yucatan to take Tumen home. And he explains to them that he hasn't seen his home in over 2 years since he was kidnapped by pirates right off the beach near his village. And he was forced then to work for these pirates and was sold off from one ship to another. And which is very depressing, but despite all the fun he has had with the crew of the Barnacle, he is happier than ever to go home. And the crew doesn't think twice to honor his wish, especially Jack, which is kind of surprising. So a few hours later, the Barnacle arrives in a small bay, and they see a small village off in the distance. But Arabella notices that the village seems empty. But Tumen tells the crew that since they are sailing in a European-style boat, everyone from his village is in hiding because the last time a boat like this came through, the people on board kidnapped him and his cousins. But Fitzwilliam, on the other hand, is completely enraptured by the village as he looks through his spyglass, saying he's never seen a primitive native village before. And Arabella then comes over and tells him to have a little respect, since this is Tumen's village they're arriving at. But while they're doing this, Tumen disembarks and calls out toward the village. And immediately after that, 2 kids, a boy and a girl, come out of hiding, and they immediately recognize Tumen, and they run toward him. So we find out that these kids are Tumen's brother Khan and his sister Kay. And after people realize it's Tumen that's returned, they all come out of hiding and smile when they see him. And then we also get to meet the leader of the village here, who is Tumen's great-grandfather Mam. And Fitzy asks if this is the witch doctor of his village, which of course is definitely not the right term to use here. But Tumen corrects him and says that he is his great-grandfather. And after Tumen introduces the crew to Mam, he tells them the village will hold a celebration tonight in Tumen's honor. And once they hear of this, Jack and Fitzy argue about who should accompany Arabella. But to their dismay, she tells them that she is going with John. And John tells Jack he is more than welcome to take Constance to the party, which of course annoys Jack. So anyway, this party begins, and everyone is having a great time. And John tells Tumen how much he is going to miss him, and Tumen says to him that he would never have survived without John, which is just so sweet. But as the night goes on, Mam begins to tell a story about the greatest treasure mankind has ever known. And Jack immediately asks if it is cursed, as if you remember from last book, he swore off magical and cursed treasure after finally ridding himself of the Sword of Cortez. But Tumen translates Mam's words as he's reciting the story. And he says that it is a treasure not to be sought out, and that it is a city of gold. And once they hear about this, Fitzy immediately thinks that they are talking about El Dorado, which of course is the famous city of gold that many of us think about when we hear the term. But Tumen corrects him and tells him it is not El Dorado, and that it is in fact another city and something far greater. But Jack immediately gets more interested in this, and Tumen translates Mam's next words, which are, "Wherever the silver lives, the city is." So the party then begins to die down soon after this is over, and the crew of the Barnacle try to figure out what Mam meant about the city of gold. And Fitzy thinks it could be like a town near a silver mine. But John thinks it means whoever seeks it out has precious metal on their mind. And then they end up disappearing and they turn up in the city of gold. So they all have these different theories about what it could mean. But Jack tells them that maybe it is just a city made of gold. And his eyes grow wide. But Tumen then stops him and reminds him it is not to be sought out. And soon after, everyone then falls asleep for the night. So then they all wake up. They're enjoying their vacation and everything, thinking about this city of gold. And then they see, once they wake up, there's people from the village shouting and making their way toward them. So everyone's like confused about what's going on. And one young boy is leading this pack of people coming toward them. And we find out this is Yoxin, who apparently has never really gotten along with Tumen. And so let's go into the book and see what happens here. So Yoxin begins and he says, You lead this filthy crew here, especially that particular filthy one with the rag on his head. And look what happened, Yoxin shouted. Or maybe it was you who stole the amulet. You dress like them now. You might as well be one of them. Amulet? Not the Sun and Stars, Tumen asked, hoping it wasn't true. Yes, the Sun and Stars Amulet, an old woman said sorrowfully. The same one the last of the Zitami entrusted to us before Cortez and his men wiped them out. We kept it safe for many years, since before my great-grandmother's mother, and now it is gone. And it disappears the same night you bring your friends here, Yoxin said accusingly, pointing at the crew with his spear. There has been some mistake, Tumen protested. Let me go speak with Mam. Yoxin sneered. Oh yes, go speak to him. You will not be happy with what you find. Or perhaps you will, who can say? Wait here, do not move, Tumen told the crew. Wouldn't think of it, mate, Jack said, getting ready to take a step to run for the Barnacle. But he quickly checked himself, noticing that many of the men had begun to pull out their spears. Tumen raced over to the sands to Mam's house. He was sure it was a mistake. Mam had helped clear it up. But when he got to his great-grandfather's hut, he could already tell something was wrong. Incense poured out of the windows in clouds, and Sheila squatted outside, shaking his head and scattering flower petals. When he looked up and saw Tumen, he just shook his head sadly. Mam is very sick. I believe it is something to do with the men you brought here. No, it can't be, Tumen forced his way in. There, in the dark, curled up on a mat, was his great-grandfather. Several villagers tended to him with bowls of broth. They laid cool, wet cloths on his brow. He has a fever, Tumen's grandmother said. She narrowed her eyes at him and almost spat. I think you should go. Tumen staggered back, stunned at the force of her anger. All of them, all of his family who he had missed for so long and whom he was so overjoyed to finally see, all of them looked at him with hate in their eyes. Yoxin was waiting for him outside, the crowd of armed men behind him. The Council of Elders has agreed, he said, sneering. You are to be expelled from the village, never to return. No, it's a mistake, Tumen began. He looked at each of his old friends, the people he had grown up with. Every one of them either looked away or met his eye with disgust. With his head hung low, Tumen headed back to the beach. He turned back once to see his little brother and sister in tears. What possibly could have happened? Maybe someone misplaced the amulet? Unlikely, after keeping it safe for so long. It was more than a little strange that it disappeared the same night he had returned, but it couldn't have had anything to do with him or his friends. Could it? After all, how well did he really know any of them anyway? They all seemed nice enough, and he had been on some great adventures with them, but except for John, he wasn't really that close with any of them. Fitzwilliam was just an uptight rich guy, as far as he could tell, and crazy, too. Who leaves a comfy, noble life to become a wandering adventurer? Arabella was friendly, if a bit quick-tempered and hot-headed, but she used to work at a tavern full of pirates and cutthroats. Could she be one, too? And then there was Jack. Jack was just plain odd and a little bit too much vested in his own interests. By the time he reached the dying bonfire, Tumen was furious. Give it back, he demanded, planting himself inches from Jack's face. Give what back, mate? Jack asked, cautiously glancing quickly to his left and right. The amulet! I know you took it! Give it back! Tumen tightened his hands into fists. What are you talking about? Arabella asked. What is Jack supposed to have taken? One of you took it. Tumen whirled around, glaring at her and Fitzwilliam. One of you took the Sun and Stars Amulet. My people have protected it for hundreds of years, and it just happens to have disappeared last night. Now, where is it? So, as you can tell from the book, Tumen is now very mad and completely outraged that he has been ostracized by his people, and he thinks that one of the crew stole the amulet. And we come to find out that none of them even know what Tumen is talking about after this. So we're going to go back into the book here and see what happens next. So Jack begins and says, "Here now, I rather resent your implications, implicating that I was implicit and whatnot," Jack said, waving his hands frantically. "I don't know anything about an amulet, much less had anything to do with taking one. Besides, had there been an amulet, I would have had to have known there had been an amulet in order to have taken an amulet. What was there to be taken? Savvy?" Also, I'm going to interrupt real quick. That took me like 10 tries to say that sentence. So, finally got it out. So, there it is. "I'm forced to agree with Jack this one time," Fitzwilliam said frostily, bracing his legs in the white sand. "How could you mistrust your own crew, your own friends, after all we have been through together? Besides, Jack couldn't have taken it," Arabella said, shooting a sneer at Jack. "He was right here all night. He snores like a pig. I barely slept at all." John put his arm around Tumen's shoulders. "Come now, mon ami. Tell us what has gotten you so upset." Tumen sank to the ground, burying his face in his hands. He felt like crying. "They have expelled me forever. From my own home. They think I led you here to steal it. And Mam is sick, and they blame me for that, too." "Expelled you? Forever?" John said with horror. Constance hissed angrily. "Tell us about this amulet," Arabella suggested soothingly. "And why it's so great that I would have stolen it," Jack added. Tumen sighed. "No one knows exactly what it is. It is supposed to be very powerful. We think the Zitami people acquired it from the Spanish. The Zitami wanted to make certain it never landed in their hands again. They did not tell our ancestors what it did, only to keep it safe." He started to draw in the sand as he spoke. "The amulet is of a white metal that is not silver. It has 3 hollow settings. The 3 missing gems were said to be lost long ago, before my people came in possession of it." The 5 crewmates looked at the drawing morosely. "Well, of course we've got to go and find it," Jack decided. "We'll get it back, return it to the village, and clear your good name. You can go home again, and we can be on our way." It wasn't just a good deed he would be doing. There was something in it for Jack, too. Returning the amulet was also a way to form some very powerful allies in the Yucatan. A useful thing for a sailing adventurer in search of treasure in safe harbors. On the other hand, right now, with this amulet missing, he has some pretty powerful enemies. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Jack shouted, sweeping his hands forward. "Go look around, see if we can find this thing, or at least some clues." The crew split up and took different sections of the area around the bay, being careful not to come too close to the village. What seemed like an impossible task ended sooner than anyone thought it might. A bright piece of cloth among the green leaves of the jungle caught Jack's attention. His eyes grew wide, and he brought everyone to the small clearing where he stood. "Feast your eyes on this, lads and lassie cat thing," he said a little smugly. There, sitting at the base of a tree between 2 roots like it had been placed carefully, was their clue. "It's a little doll," Arabella said with wonder, reaching for it. It was little more than 2 sticks crossed and wrapped in cloth, built up to make a body and head. The head had no hair, but the face had a stitched mouth and eyes. It was dressed in a strangely familiar white and red cloth with purple X's down the middle, and had a miniature jade necklace around its neck. "Look at the clothes it wears," Tumen exclaimed, picking it up. "Those are Mam's robes." John took the creepy little figure and looked at it grimly. "It is a doll made by someone who practices magics." He pulled the doll's clothes apart at the chest. Over where the heart would have been was a drawing in blood-red ink, a crescent dagger with a serpent wrapped around it. John let out a low whistle. "Oh, we're in for it now. This is the sign of Madame Minuit, Madame Midnight of New Orleans. This is her doing." "Like Tia Dalma?" Jack asked. "A practitioner of the mystical arts, as they say?" John nodded. "She is a very, very powerful woman, but she only uses her powers for her own profit. This could be why your great-grandfather is sick, Tumen. She is using this doll to make him sick." "Why would anyone do that?" Tumen asked, exasperated. "Mam has never done anything bad to anyone. He has never even been to New Orleans. He has never even been out of the Yucatan." "I don't know, but I'll bet that maybe, just maybe, this precious amulet you keep going on and on about has something to do with it," Jack pointed out sarcastically. "Why must I always need to state the obvious to you people?" Tumen blinked. The connection was obvious. The disappearance of the amulet, Mam suddenly becoming sick, the doll couldn't have been a coincidence. He turned and went back to the village. The others followed. "I've got to see Mam," Tumen protested when Yaxen tried to stop him. "I am sorry," Tumen's older brother, Chila, said sadly, also blocking his way. "But if you try to come back here again, we will need to turn you and your friends away, forcefully. Please go, and take with you the evil that has invaded our village. You are not my brother any longer. They have changed you." That is also very depressing. So things are very dire for Tumen now, as we can tell. And the only hope he has to be welcomed back into his home is if he can find this amulet, which the crew suspects to be in the possession of Madame Minuit, as John said earlier. So then we go from the Yucatan over to the Gulf of Mexico, since we are going to New Orleans. And as they sail through the night, they come into contact with another ship. But as the Barnacle gets closer, they realize that it is dead in the water. And no sounds, no crew, nothing at all. So Jack steers the Barnacle closer, and they find out the ship is completely made of bronze. Even some of the water around the ship was bronze as well. And Arabella initially believes it's some sort of sculpture, but the rest of the crew is not so sure. So Jack wheels up the courage and makes his way onto the bronze ship to check it out. And he steps on the bronze water, which cracks under his weight, and he quickly jumps onto the ship, making sure not to fall, because if he did fall, the metal water would definitely not be as kind to him as normal water. But once Jack boards, he realizes every single thing on the ship is made of bronze. Jack goes over to the helm, and he sees a man entirely made of bronze standing by the wheel. And it is completely perfect. There's no detail out of place. And he notices the bronze man's mouth was open as if he was screaming. So Jack starts to get a little creeped out by all this. And as he searches the ship, he finds the rest of the crew, who all happen to be bronze as well. And then Jack finally heads into the captain's cabin, and he finds the captain of the ship on the ground, bronze as well, but the captain was holding his hands at his throat like he was choking or being tortured by something. And then Jack finds a doll, which had also turned to bronze, but a doll that was very similar to the one they had found in Tumen's village. This doll was dressed like the captain, just like the one they had found earlier was dressed like Mam. So we can obviously deduce that these are voodoo dolls. So Jack makes his way back onto the Barnacle, and he shows the crew the doll that he found, and John points out the mark of Madame Minuit, just like the Mam doll had as well. But after this encounter, the Barnacle sails on toward New Orleans, and John is most excited out of everyone. And it is very cool to see New Orleans show up in this book, since it is a location that has a lot of significance in Pirates of the Caribbean lore. Not so much in the movies, but of course the original Pirates of the Caribbean ride at Disneyland that opened in 1967, it resides in New Orleans Square. So this location has always kind of gone hand in hand with Pirates of the Caribbean in a way. And of course, in real life, New Orleans had a lot to do with pirates. Many of you will probably recognize the name Jean Lafitte, especially you Disney theme park fans out there. But maybe in the future we'll cover some more of that. But anyway, they park the Barnacle at the dock, and as soon as they disembark, the port official, along with some policemen, come over to them. So we'll go back into the book here, and the first man begins, "What is all this, then?" The first man asked in French, then repeated in heavily accented English. He had a sharp little nose and squinty little eyes, just the sort of man who enjoyed bureaucracy and making trouble for perfectly honest adventurers. "Excuse me, good sir," Jack said, sweeping his cap off as he bowed. "We're just here for a bit of pleasure. Seeing your fine city, its lovely restaurants. Just tourists, really. No trouble for you at all." "Where are your papers?" the official demanded, shaking his hand at them. "This is a commercial port. You have to have your papers to dock." "Well, we would have papers, kind sir, except we're not, as you can see, a commercial vessel," Jack pointed out, raising an eyebrow in the direction of the Barnacle. He had to think fast. Getting into a row with the local police as soon as they came ashore was not a good way to quietly look for the powerful Madame Minuit. He leaned over and spoke confidentially to the official. "I didn't want to have to tell you this, because I'm not supposed to, but we're actually on a secret mission transporting a powerful member of the French aristocracy." The official gave him a skeptical look. Oh yes, I am sure a French nobleman would travel aboard such a fishing boat with such a crew, he said, waving his hand dismissively. Unfortunately, Jack had to admit the Barnacle didn't really look like a counselor ship. The beams were all warped, where it had paint it was peeling, and the whole thing reeked of ancient fish. None of them looked like French aristocracy either. Tumen definitely didn't. Arabella's pretty enough to pass for a duchess, but her dress was worn, and she stood and glared like, well, a tavern girl. John spoke fluent French, but he looked about as aristocratic as Belle, and Fitzwilliam, well actually, in his somewhat still pristine blue jacket, gleaming sword at his side, Fitz really did look the part. Jack nodded desperately at him. Fitzwilliam understood immediately. He stepped forward, shoulders back, head high, classic disdain on his face. Bonjour, monsieur, he began in flawless French. John whispered, translating for Jack, Tumen, and Arabella. Jack shooed him away, as if to say he didn't need a translator. What is the hold-up? I demand to be led ashore at once, Fitzwilliam continued. Excuse me, monsieur nobleman, the official said, no more polite than before. Please enlighten me as to why you are traveling in such conditions, and without papers. I am a cartographer in the employ of the king himself, Fitzwilliam said smoothly. I was sent here to complete the survey of the territory in Louisiana we have rightfully taken back from the Spanish. My ship here was beset upon by pirates. I believe I am the sole survivor. These lowly, he looked at his friends, fisher persons saved my life and are escorting me upriver until a replacement crew and ship are sent. The official sniffed and shook his head. I have had no word of any royal ship that was commandeered by pirates, or any such map-making expedition. Have you heard any news from the court at all, then? Fitzwilliam shot back. Please do not tell me that His Majesty's messenger ship was lost as well. A likely story. First your ship is lost, then the mail boat, the agent sneered, but his men were beginning to look unsure. Do you want to bring down the anger of the throne upon you? Fitzwilliam demanded frostily. The port agent considered it. On the very remote possibility the young man before him wasn't lying, he and his men might face the guillotine if they didn't let him through, or at least receive a reprimand and a demotion. And besides, look at the rest of them. At worst, they were a bunch of young sailors come to New Orleans for some fun. What harm could they do? All right, the port agent said. You are free to go, but move your mighty Barnacle to the far end of the port. I cannot have a vile old fishing boat here. He even saluted Fitzwilliam, just in case. Merci, Jack said, saluting him back. That was fantastic, Fitz, Arabella said, hugging him. The noble boy kept his stoic expression, but blushed. I had no idea you spoke French so well, John laughed, slapping him on the back. You didn't make too bad a hash of it, Jack conceded. Now, let's go bring the mighty Barnacle to the other side of the port and finally disembark. I just think that whole thing is just hilarious. But anyway, once they think all their troubles are behind them now they've finally docked, they realize that was only the beginning, as the sun begins to beat down on them as they walk through the city. And everyone is already annoyed by the mosquitoes that are constantly pestering them, which is very, very relatable. And I love how Fitzy says, I only hope we do not get malaria. But despite them all having a terrible time, John is feeling great and happy to be back in New Orleans. We also get introduced to the vibe of New Orleans here as well, with the street magicians and the soothsayers and all kinds of weird and shady characters that are lining the streets. And as they make their way through the town, Jack asks John if any of them are Madame Minuit. But John tells him that Madame Minuit is far worse than the people they have seen so far. And John is about to give them some sort of direction, but he instantly goes into a daze and he stares straight ahead, and Arabella and Fitzy make their way over to them, asking what happened, but Jack replies, I haven't the foggiest. But we come to realize this is not a spell. It is only a scent of food that is enrapturing John once again, which of course happened for the first time back in Book 3, The Pirate Chase, if you remember that. But Jack snaps John out of it and asks again where they can find Madame Minuit. He tells them that she is not easy to find and that no one knows where her hideout is. And apparently it is rumored to move from place to place. But John gets distracted by the smell of food once again, and Jack eventually just lets them all have a break to eat. And John brings them over to a food stall, buys a bowl for himself before telling them it is alligator stew. Everyone else recoils at this, but Jack buys them all bowls of it and begins to enjoy their lunch. I can't speak to the quality of alligator stew because I've never had alligator stew, but Seems like John enjoys it, so it must be good. Anyway, Jack's attention is drawn to something happening close by as he hears two people talking, so he begins to snoop in on them, and he's able to get a good view, and he sees an old man with multiple snakes around his neck, carrying a staff with a skull on top of it, and there's also a kid around Jack's age, as the book says, holding something in his hand. But when the kid mentions the bronze ship, everyone turns and looks at them, and they see the kid is holding an amulet, and not just any amulet, the Sun and Stars Amulet that was stolen from Tumen's village. So Jack and the crew immediately run over to the old man and the kid, trying to get the amulet back. And we're going to go back into the book here to see what goes down. So Jack pulls out his sword, but the boy blocks it with the amulet. So in the book it says, the boy turned his hand out, blocking the sword with the amulet. There was a strange noise, like a hiss, and the stink of something burning. Jack watched in surprise as a reddish gold color swallowed his sword from where it touched the amulet on up. In less than a second, his sword had been turned into bronze. It was much heavier than before, and the unexpected weight pulled Jack's hand down. Well, we'll finish this the old-fashioned way, he said cheerfully, letting it drop and putting up his fists. Fitzwilliam joined him at his side, and John rolled up his sleeves, ready for a good rumble. A still angry Tumen pulled out his obsidian knife. Jack tried to grab the amulet. The boy pulled it back at the last minute, slamming his other fist into Jack's side. Jack doubled over in pain as John dove at the boy's legs, trying to tackle him to the ground. The boy shot his hands out wildly, trying to keep his balance. Jack recovered himself and lunged forward again and was rewarded by being slammed in the face by the amulet. Clonk. His jaw shook with a head-shattering pain. It felt like a tooth had been knocked clear out of his mouth. Yep, there was that burning metallic taste of blood. Not the first time he had lost a tooth, but this felt like a whole row of them from one side of his mouth. Jack tried to run his tongue over the hole where his teeth had been. Then he realized the tooth was still there. The acrid taste wasn't just metallic, it was metal. Forgetting the fight for a moment, he panicked and turned to look at his reflection in a nearby window. He gasped. A row of metal teeth shined out amongst his other sort of white ones. The boy, or the amulet, had turned it to bronze. John, Tumen, and Fitzwilliam had taken over where Jack left off. They had managed to wrestle the boy to the ground. Arabella crept up behind the mystic, raising her soup bowl over his head. But just as she was about to bring it down on his skull, he suddenly raised his hands in the air and shouted something in a language none of the friends knew. All the dead snakes around his neck came alive. Arabella jumped back as they began writhing and hissing, snapping at everyone who came near them. Taking advantage of Fitzwilliam and John's surprise, the boys slithered out of their grasp and leapt up. The old man grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him close. Two of the snakes began gasping. It looked as if they were regurgitating prey. Two round objects worked their way up their necks. The old man put his hands out, and the twin snakes each vomited a pearly white egg into his hands. With another cry, the man raised the eggs above his head and then smashed them to the ground. They exploded with a cloud of smoke and the stench of rotten eggs. The crew of the Barnacle fell back, eyes stinging from the sulphurous cloud. When they were able to see again, the boy and the old man were gone. There goes the amulet, Tumen said sadly. Again. Who in the 12th ring of Davy Jones' locker was that? Jack demanded. That, John said, was Madame Minuit. So first of all, we see that whatever the amulet touches turns to bronze. And it turned not only Jack's sword to bronze, but some of his teeth as well. And this will develop later on as well. I won't get into it yet because that happens in the next book. But this develops, and I think it's such a cool way to explain Jack's metal teeth that we see in the movies. Because as you know, Jack has a ton of gold teeth, he has some silver teeth and stuff like that. So this is a great way to kind of explain a bit of that. I think it's such a cool little detail. But as John told them, the old man they saw was Madame Minuit, who apparently can shapeshift essentially into two different forms. The first form being the old man they had seen just a few minutes ago, but John doesn't know what her other form looks like. And when Fitzy asks how he can be sure it was her, John tells him that the serpents are her trademark, and the snakes that the old man had around his neck gave it away. But Jack changes the subject to talk about the amulet. He tells them that there was something in one of the three settings, which is interesting given that Tumen had described it with three empty settings. Jack says that the slot that was filled had a piece of bronze in it, which must explain the bronze ship they had seen earlier, along with Jack's sword and his teeth. And after coming to this conclusion, Jack and the crew fantasized about what they could do with the amulet, or if they put a diamond into it. What if it made things diamond instead? And they're all getting carried away before John is able to stop them and tell them that they should not be finding it for its power, but to return it to Tumen's village. And after this, Constance returns with a key in her mouth, and she leads them over to where she'd found it, which just happened to be the spot where Madame Minuit and the kid disappeared. So everyone tries to figure out what the key goes to. So we'll go back into the book here, and Fitzwilliam begins, "Perhaps it is the key to a chest, a key to where Madame keeps her treasure, like the amulet." "Oh, that makes a pile of sense," Jack said, shaking his head. "How convenient. The Madam, or Mr. Madam, or whatever she is, just happens to drop the precious key to her precious chest of magical and precious treasures." "She did not look like the sort of woman who likes pink ribbons," Tumen pointed out. The others had to agree. The undead snakes and crazy old man disguise didn't seem to go with ribbon and lace. "Maybe it's the key to a house," John suggested, "where she is staying or hiding out." "Wonderful," Arabella said bitterly. She handed the key to Fitzwilliam so he could get a closer look. "How many houses are there in New Orleans? All we have to do is try each one." As Fitzwilliam put out his hand to take the key, Jack slapped the boy's wrist and grabbed it himself. He held it up to the light as Fitzwilliam began to bluster. Running his fingers along the shaft, he felt the bumpy, raised texture. He spat on his thumb and rubbed it harder. After a moment, some of the dirt and finish came off. He tilted it forward and squinted at it. "Albergue d'Orleans," he finally was able to read. And I said it like that mainly because the book says that is how he pronounced it. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jack says. "Auberge is an inn," John explained. "It is the Inn of Orleans. They talked about building it while I lived here. I guess they have completed it now. I think it is a place for the rich. I have no idea where it is, though." Jack sighed. "Right then. Let's ask the friendly natives." He put the key in his pocket and plastered a giant friendly smile on his face. Unfortunately, the more normal-looking natives seemed to have left after the lunchtime rush. Most of the people who remained were more street mystics, indignates, and people of questionable trade. He chose a large woman in a bright yellow dress having tea outside a small shop. From the back, at least, she looked like an upright, wholesome citizen. "Excuse me, madam," Jack said, giving her a sweeping bow. "I was wondering if you could possibly tell me the—" "Yeah!" The woman turned around expectantly. She had a full, black, curly beard. "Yes?" she asked in a deep, husky voice. "Read your tea leaves?" "Ah, no thank you, not today. I'm having coffee," Jack apologized, backing away. A gentleman walked by, dressed appropriately, Jack thought, in a top hat and shiny polished boots. Jack took a moment to study him, though, to make sure. "Excuse me, good sir," Jack said, pressing his hands together and bowing. "I was wondering if you could kindly—" "Let your blood? Absolutely," the man replied eagerly. He held up a syringe and a jar full of wet black, squirming things. "Needle or leeches?" Jack backed away slowly. "Terribly sorry. I thought you were someone else, entirely, without the, sucky things." This was getting ridiculous. Where was a gendarme or a policeman where you actually needed one? Jack stomped through the crowd of freaks and magicians. Then it was as if they parted, clearing a path before him. At the end of it was one of the most spectacular women he had ever seen. She was tall and had porcelain white skin that fairly gleamed against the midnight black dress that hugged her body. Her hair was blood red, so dark it looked almost black, and she wore beautifully gemmed netting over it. Trailing from her hand was a masquerade mask, green and spangled with sparkling silver fangs. She wasn't exactly normal, or what Jack was looking for, but she was slightly more reliable seeming than his other options, and besides, she was gorgeous. "Excuse me, madam," he began, as he stepped forward. "I was wondering if you could point me in the direction of the Auberge d'Orleans, and the quickest possible route there, if you could. I'm in a bit of a hurry." The woman parted her lips in a beautiful smile. "Bonne chance," she said. "That is exactly where I am going. You can follow me there." Her accent was heavily French, not that different from the man at the docks who checked for the crew's papers. Jack smiled cockily. He waved to the crew to come over. Everyone but Arabella looked relieved. She took one look at the beautiful woman and frowned. When she saw Fitzwilliam began to straighten his jacket, she hit him. The woman walked ahead with Jack, her hips swaying gracefully as she went. She cast sidelong looks at the five friends, and she bit her lip. "The Auberge is a very formal place," she said as politely as she could. The crew of the Barnacle looked at each other. Only then did they notice how dirty their clothes were. Even the impeccable Fitzwilliam could have used a bit of a wash. It wasn't like they had a chance to do laundry or freshen up since their adventures began. John tried to pat the dust off his shirt. Constance, trotting along beside them, spat on the ground derisively. It almost seemed as if she liked being mangy and dirty. "There is a masquerade tonight," the woman suggested. "You might be able to get in if you are in costume, and cleaned up a bit, but your dreadful old cat will never be allowed." Constance arched her back and hissed at the woman. John scooped up his sister and hugged her defensively. "Oh, leaving that thing behind won't be a problem," Jack said suavely to the clear consternation of John. He gave a wink to his friends. "We have to get in. A cousin of mine, he's in the shipping business. Rum, of course. What else would it be? Rum and bananas, all over the world. Huge exporter. Tremendously well respected in New Orleans. Going to get us all jobs. Owes me, he does. But he's a bit of a hotshot, big fella, you know the type. Very hoity-toity on you. We can't miss the appointment. Hate people like that, don't you? No leeway at all." He gave the woman his most winning smile. She smiled back. "Well, I am a fairly well-respected member of New Orleans society," she said with a wink. "Perhaps I can assist you." "Most grateful, beautiful lady," Jack said with another bow. Then he dropped back and whispered to his friends. "Did you see? She's absolutely crazy about me. Ain't no crime in being charming and handsome." So anyway, this mysterious lady then leads them all to the Auberge d'Orleans and lets them all inside. And this place is beautiful, way out of their league. And Fitzy gets a little uncomfortable when they walk in because it makes him remember back to the balls that he was forced into going to back home. But the woman calls them over to her and gives them all masquerade masks to wear. So Jack wears this golden mask with a sharp, pointy nose. Arabella takes a red one with large feathers that cover over her ears. Fitzy takes a more traditional mask that has like a fake tricorn hat on top. And John and Tumen put on matching devil masks with horns and pointy eyebrows. And after the woman gives them these masks, she leaves them. And they notice once again how the crowd parts for her wherever she goes, which is definitely a little peculiar. But Jack notices down the hall that there is an old woman with snakes around her neck dressed in green. He assumes it is Madame Minuit, but then they see other people in the hall also wearing snakes. So now they're all confused, and they see all these people dressed with snakes in some sort of way. But Jack tells them to split up and see if any of the partygoers are Madame Minuit. And brace yourself, this next entry from the book is going to be a bit of a long one. So here we go. Jack headed toward the first woman they had spotted at the far end of the ballroom. John and Tumen crept up on the man with the snake belt, and Fitzwilliam and Arabella approached the lady with the cane. With all the partiers in the ballroom, it was easy to mingle and hide among them. The woman with the blood-red hair who had led them to the hotel stepped up to a podium. The crowd began applauding. The crew of the Barnacle hastily did the same, trying to blend in as much as possible. "Welcome, everyone," the woman said in a rich voice that carried well, "to our annual Masquerade Noir." With the audience's attention elsewhere, the five friends began to inch toward their targets. Arabella took a deep breath. The woman with the snake on the cane had a small purse hanging off her wrist, just about the right size for an amulet. With Fitzwilliam looking nervous, Arabella started to sneak her hand into the purse, just as she had seen pickpockets do back in Tortuga. Almost there. "Aha!" Jack's voice rang out. The old woman he had been tailing was right in front of him. The telltale gleam of a silvery amulet shone against her neck. Arabella jerked her hand back quickly so as not to be noticed. Tumen and John also jumped away from their man. Fitzwilliam's hand went to his sword. Constance hissed. The entire room turned to look at Jack. So did the gorgeous woman who had let them in, but unlike the rest of the partygoers, she did not look shocked or surprised. In fact, she looked satisfied. It was almost as if she knew something like this was going to happen, like this was the reason she had brought the crew of the Barnacle to the hotel. "J'accuse!" Jack cried triumphantly at the old woman with the amulet. He spun her around roughly and presented her to the crowd. This vile, this powerful, this rather frail-looking old woman might not look so threatening. Oh no, not in the least. But ladies and gentlemen, do not let her fool you. She is vile and powerful. Look at her snakes. He grabbed one to hold it up. It fell limply in his hand, soft and tickly. What he and John both thought were snakes were actually just dark green boas. Okay, well, they look like snakes. Obviously, they're meant to be snakes. I mean, come on, from a distance? Jack said, almost stuttering. Jack sighed as Jack prattled on. Fitzwilliam shook his head. We've been following her, you see, he explained to the confused-looking audience. He pressed his hands together like a teacher and strode back and forth. All the way from the Yucatan, where she used weird little dolls to make a poor old witch doctor sick. He is not a witch doctor, Tumen mumbled. He is my great-grandfather. Jack shot him an exasperated look. Okay, even worse. She made an old great-grandfather sick, just to take his amulet. His powerful, magical amulet that turns things into bronze. Well, all right, I realize that doesn't sound that powerful, he admitted. I didn't really think so either. I mean, it's not like it turns things into gold or even chocolate, but it did turn an entire ship into, bronze, and well, look, the amulet! He ended his speech quickly, grabbing a necklace from the woman and holding it up. You are all in the presence of the mysterious and greatly feared Madame Minuit. The crowd was silent. Then the woman with the blood-red hair laughed. Are you sure that is the right amulet, Jack? She purred. Jack frowned. He looked at the golden disc in his hand. It actually looked nothing like the amulet they were searching for. It had none of that piece's elegance. Instead, it was filled with ugly, big red and green gems. The sort of jewelry a crazy old rich woman would wear. Wait, how did you know my name? He asked, suddenly realizing what she had said. The woman just laughed again and clapped her hands. Let us help you find your amulet. Perhaps it is the one over there, or the one Mademoiselle Calais is wearing over by the door, or maybe that one. With nasty leers and smiles, many others in the crowd pulled out gleaming amulets. They waved them tauntingly. None of the amulets were quite right. Some were square, some had moons on them, some had a different number of empty places where gems would go. Jack, Arabella said worriedly, perhaps Monsieur Vautois is wearing it, the woman on the podium continued. Or perhaps you are looking for mine. She triumphantly pulled out an amulet of her own, a stolen amulet of her own. 7 points, 4 filled with jade, 2 empty settings, and 1 with a bronze gem in it. Well, I guess you would be the lovely Madame Minuit, then, Jack said weakly. She threw her head back and laughed a terrible hissing laugh. Welcome to your first masquerade noir, my dear new friends. Now, let's see if you can survive the experience. The old woman with the snake boas grinned at Jack and slowly lowered her mask. Instead of the frail-looking old biddy Jack expected, her eyes glowed yellow like a snake's and her cheeks were scaly. The muscles on her face and head stood out as if she were possessed. She hissed. The man in front of John and Tumen threw his mask down. His face was chalky, and the whites of his eyes were red. His hands were clawed with long, yellow fingernails. Mon Dieu, John whispered. He is possessed! Jack! They are all possessed by Madame Minuit! Around the room, everyone was taking off their masks. They all had crazed faces and stricken, leering mouths. Thank you for the update there, mate, Jack called back bravely. I think I could have figured that out myself. And then the possessed attacked. Get her! Get Madame Minuit! Jack shouted, waving his hands frantically. She's controlling them! Easier said than done. John and Tumen had their backs to each other as a group of partygoers closed in. Tumen pulled out his obsidian knife. Remember, these are normal people under a spell, John cried, punching the man with the snake belt as he lunged at them. Try not to hurt them too much. Tumen sighed and put his knife away. Then he kicked the feet out from underneath the person closest to him. It was too crowded in the ballroom for Fitzwilliam to draw his sword. He put out a protective arm in front of Arabella and headbutted a gaunt old man who was drooling black ooze. Arabella thought fast and grabbed the snake cane from the woman they had been trailing and clocked him with it. But for each of the fiends defeated, there were 5 more possessed partygoers behind them. Jack knocked one down and leaped over him, kicking another one in the face as he went. A third stuck out a nasty clawed hand, and Jack spun out of the way, keeping his fist out and taking down 2 more. And they kept coming. With a final shove, Jack made it up to the podium. He ran forward and reached out to grab the amulet. The woman held up her hand. A snake came down from around her neck and slithered daintily down her arm. It raised its head and hissed at Jack. Suddenly, he couldn't move. It was as if he had no control over his own legs. He watched in horror as more snakes slithered up and around the woman's neck and down her arms. She strode forward calmly, the snakes hissing and flicking their tongues out as she went. The possessed crowd made room for her as she passed by, bowing. Arabella raised a pitchfork from a nearby hearth to strike Madame Minuit, but 2 of the Madame snakes rose up and hissed, one at Arabella and one at Fitzwilliam. They, too, were then frozen in place. Fitzwilliam's arm was stuck reaching for his sword. Arabella opened her mouth to scream, but she couldn't. Madame Minuit made for John and Tumen next. 2 more snakes hissed, and the boys couldn't move either. The crowd gibbered and cackled. Madame Minuit looked around the room, smiling smugly. The crew of the Barnacle struggled in vain against the spell holding them. Madame Minuit approached Jack and waved her hand in front of them. Suddenly, he could move his mouth, but nothing else. "Tell me," she said in a hypnotic voice, "why you chase after the power of the amulet." Jack felt himself compelled to speak. "The whole story?" Jack asked. "If you please," Madame Minuit said sinisterly. Unfortunately for the madam, Jack was never at a loss for words. "Well, you see," he began with relish, "it all started on the coast of the Yucatan. You know, white sandy beaches, yellow sun, blue skies, tall palm trees, that sort of thing. A veritable paradise. Actually, a real paradise. Great place to get away, if you know what I mean, for a holiday or a long rest from the job. The food there is simply marvelous, too. The natives have this amazing way with iguana and dog. Well, maybe not so much dog, but they have this delightful cream sauce. Growing impatient, Madame Minuit had one of her snakes hiss in Jack's face. Jack quickly became silent. "It is obvious you have no idea about the real power of the amulet," she said dramatically, stroking one of her snakes on the head. "Of course we do," Jack cut in, fighting the spell. "It goes around turning things into bronze. Big deal. Bronze. Phew." Madame Minuit looked irritated. He had interrupted her big moment. "It may turn things into bronze, as you say, in its current state," she said acidly. "But it is also the key to the city of gold." "This city of gold business again." "I am sorry, my friends," she went on, "but you have become too great a threat to the amulet, and me. You leave me no choice. I must turn you over to the serpents." 4 large snakes slithered down her body and out to John, Tumen, Arabella, and Fitzwilliam. They raised themselves up and swayed back and forth. Madame Minuit held her arm up near Jack. A snake raised its head and bared its fangs, preparing to strike. Jack said, crossed eyes from staring at the snake before him. He desperately tried to move, to fall down, to do anything to get out of its path, but it was no use. He was still paralyzed. The snake reared back and opened its jaw. Suddenly, Madame Minuit began shaking. Her hands flew to her neck and she screamed. The snakes all started writhing with her, pulling back from their intended victims. Jack lurched to the side as he was released from the spell. He caught himself and leaped up, sword out. The rest of the crew of the Barnacle also shook themselves awake, stepping quickly away from the snakes. Madame Minuit fell to her knees. Behind her was the boy they had seen her with before back in the market, the one who originally had the amulet. Now he held a weird little doll, one with red hair and a black dress, a miniature Madame Minuit. He twisted its head and neck. Madame Minuit twisted and writhed in agony. Constance poked her head out from behind the boy's legs and meowed cautiously. The key hung around her neck. So that was a lot that happened there, but anyway, the kid they had seen earlier with Madame Minuit has now turned against her, in case you didn't realize there. And this allows Jack and the rest of the crew to escape. Before they leave, Jack grabs the amulet from Madame Minuit, and him and the rest of the crew, along with this boy, begin to make their escape. And all the possessed partygoers are now in a frenzy, and they're destroying everything inside the Auberge d'Orleans. And as they run, the amulet in Jack's hand swings out and hits a man in the chest, and the man immediately turns into bronze. There's no time, though, to see what happened, as everyone's still on the run, and the amulet keeps swinging around as Jack's running, and everything it hits turns into bronze. And as they finally make it to the exit, the amulet smashes into the door frame, and the door turns to bronze, but it doesn't stop there. The bronze keeps going, and it goes all the way up and turns the entire building to bronze. So we're going to go back into the book here real quick to see what happens with this amulet and New Orleans. "Hold that thing close to you," the boy yelled at Jack as they ran through the streets. Unfortunately, the suggestion came a moment too late. As they rounded a corner, the amulet knocked into a lamppost. Jack watched in horror as the cobbled street below him began to turn into bronze. Houses, buildings, side streets, walls, alleys, flower pots. The crew didn't stop running until they made it back to the dock and onto the Barnacle. Only once they were safely aboard did they turn to look back at New Orleans. The entire city gleamed dully under the light of the rising moon. "Oh, wonderful," Jack said sarcastically. "A city of bronze, the stuff that dreams are made of." Fortunately, unlike the boat they had found in the Gulf, It looked like people and animals hadn't been turned. They were walking, looking very confused, and falling a lot. Apparently bronze walkways were much more slippery than stone ones. Hold it! It was the boy who had been with Madame Minuit. He was trying to board the Barnacle too. Fitzwilliam stood with one foot on the rail of the boat, his sword pointed at the boy's chest. What, pray tell, do you think you are doing? He demanded. Please, the boy begged. His blue eyes were wide with terror. Let me come with you. I can't hold her forever. When she sees what I've done, she'll kill me. Why should I let you on board? Jack asked. Why should I trust you? You obviously stole the amulet from Tumen's witch doctor. Great-grandfather, Tumen corrected, somewhat tiredly. And used that weirdo dolly thing to make him sick, Jack continued. And you turned that entire ship and its crew to bronze. But I just saved you from the madam, didn't I? The boy pointed out. He kept looking over his shoulder as he was expecting her to appear at any moment. Yes, but then you also tried to kill us back in the square. Jack looked him angrily in the eyes. The boy really did look terrified. And he didn't really fit the role of partner to the beautiful Madame Minuit. His feet were bare. His trousers were worn and torn. His face dirty. He was little more than a street urchin. Maybe some poor boy she had kidnapped to do her dirty work. There they are! A crew of fancy-dressed people in masks had gathered at the foot of the dock. Dock workers and sailors looked confused at their sudden appearance. The harbor master strode up to them, demanding to know what they were doing. This is property of the port of Nouvelle Orleans, he said, flustered. Do you have your papers? A possessed man hissed and headbutted him in the skull. The harbor master fell like a sack of wet mud into the river. Jack, Arabella said worriedly. I'm completely on it, Jack said. Rather than taking the time to carefully untie and coil up the ropes, he pulled out his sword and brought it down on them. The lines were severed, and the Barnacle was free of the dock. Maybe a bronze sword isn't all that bad after all, he said thoughtfully, looking at his blade. John and Tumen leaned over, giving the dock a good shove. They pushed off just as the first of the crowd reached the boat. One man overshot and fell into the water, letting out a horrible gurgling scream. The boy looked around him and made a decision. Possessed folks behind him on the dock, a rapidly retreating boat before him in the water. He leaped. His feet just cleared the water, the drowning man who had just fallen off the dock reaching for his ankles. The boy landed on the edge of the deck, barely making it. The possessed crowd parted. Madame Minuit stepped forward, dozens of snakes wrapped around her upraised arms. They hissed loudly and evilly. The crew of the Barnacle shrank back. Don't worry, the boy told them. She is too far away for her snakes to have any power over you. We're safe, for now. John shuddered, then forced himself to turn and began hauling up the sails. Tumen and Fitzwilliam joined in making the boat ready. Jack took the wheel, spinning it hard to get away. Go where you will, Madame Minuit shouted triumphantly at them. But the city of gold is wherever gold has lived. That was almost exactly what Mam had said. What did they both know about the city and the amulet? It was something to think about. Later. Right now, it was time to concentrate on escaping. The Barnacle drifted away from the port of New Orleans. The now bronze city gleamed faintly in the moonlight, and Madame Minuit's laughter echoed over the water. So, as we just found out, the entire city of New Orleans has now turned to bronze, and everyone fortunately was able to escape, along with Madame Minuit's ex-partner. And Tumen asks the boy what would have happened to them if the snakes bit them, and he tells them all it would have made them slaves to Madame Minuit like he had been. He says the effects wear off after time, so she has to have the snakes keep biting you over and over to stay under her control. Then the boy pulls up his sleeve, and he shows them dozens of bite marks from snakes all over his arm. And he tells them that he was the one to steal the amulet from Tumen's village, but it was because he was under Madame Minuit's control. And he tells Tumen his great-grandfather should be all right now that Madame Minuit doesn't have the doll. And Jack then asks him about the bronze ship they had encountered earlier. So we go back in the book here, and Jack says, but what about the ship? He took his hands off the wheel and waved his arms. Big, bronze, in the middle of the Gulf ship? The boy frowned. That was more of Madame's orders. She had me search the ship for the bronze bullet. That is what the gem is called. He pointed at the amulet, which now hung safely around Jack's neck. Captain Henshaw was the last person known to have it. It's the first stone in the amulet, the one you need to activate its power. Madame Minuit made another doll of him so I could get him to tell me where the bullet was hidden, and then steal it. All right then, Arabella said, frowning. But why leave the dolls? Didn't you want to hang on to them? Didn't you just say that they lose their power if they fall out of the maker's hands? "It's true," the boy said, nodding at Jean. "But I dropped them on purpose. As the snake bites began to heal, the spell wears off. During those times when Madame Minuit has little power over me, I formed a plan. I left the dolls as clues during those moments of clarity, so someone would find them and know it was Madame Minuit doing all these horrible things. I hoped that someone would find the dolls and come after her. And you did." "I like the way you think, mate," Jack said, warming up to the newcomer. Then Jack pointed at Constance and the key around her neck. She hissed at him out of habit. "What about the key there?" "It's to the hotel room she kept me in. I dropped it, too, on purpose when Madame Minuit was transporting us out of the market," the boy explained, grinning at his own cleverness. "I hoped you would come find me. Somehow this cat got a hold of it and slipped it under my door. Beautiful thing, whatever she is." He smiled and scratched Constance under the chin. Constance purred. "Okay, what are you drinking, and where can I get some?" Jack asked. "Beautiful," Arabella asked doubtfully, exchanging a look with Fitzwilliam. The mangy cat purred with pleasure, exposing her crooked yellow teeth. About time someone respected her natural beauty. John beamed. "My sister, good job." "I had stolen one of Madame's dolls earlier, during one of those times when I was myself again, those moments of clarity," the boy continued. "I dressed it like her, so when I came to the ballroom I was able to use her own power against her to free you." "Right clever of you," Jack said. They were all impressed by the young boy's ingenuity and perseverance. "Imagine putting together a plan for escape while still under the spell of a sorceress. What's your name, lad?" Jack asked, holding the wheel with one hand and sticking out his other hand to shake. "Timothy. Tim Hawk, sir," the boy said. The crew of the Barnacle shrugged. Never heard of him, but Jack definitely enjoyed being called sir. He was pretty sure he was going to like the newest member of his crew. "Well, Timothy Tim Hawk, sir," Jack said cheerfully. "Now that we've got your ex-employer's amulet, we can bring it back to Tumen's village in the Yucatan. Tumen will once again be accepted by his friends and family, we'll have a strong ally on the coast, the amulet will be safe, and everyone will live happily ever after." Tumen smiled in gratitude, and maybe a little in surprise. Was Jack really giving up a mystery, magic, and most of all, treasure? Just to help his friend out? Jack wasn't a bad guy, but this was unlike him. That's everyone's happily ever after except for the good people of that there city," Jack added, pointing at the coast. "New Orleans will have to suffer the sad fate of being transformed into the not really glamorous city of bronze. Not one for myths of the history books, I'd wager." Tim studied him curiously. "You're just going to give the amulet back? You're not the least bit interested about what the other stones in the amulet will do?" Jack thought about it for a moment. Really and truly, he searched his soul. "No," he finally said flatly. The determined look in his eyes convinced his crew. So we then find out from that, of course, that this boy's name is Timothy Hawk, and we'll learn more about him in the next book. But for now, we go to the next morning, where the Barnacle is sailing through the Gulf of Mexico back to the Yucatan. But they're all surprised when they hear a strange voice calling out to them. So there's the last little entry here for this episode. Let's go back into the book and see who this is. "Crew of the Barnacle!" a thunderingly loud voice called out, seemingly from the air itself. The crew turned around. They had all been so busy looking at the bronze ship that they had never noticed the wooden ship that was coming up right behind them. "Halt! Who goes there? Oh, no," Jack trailed off exasperatedly. It wasn't just a boat. It was a galleon, huge and strong, with many, many cannons. It flew the Jolly Roger, a pirate ship, a nasty-looking one. "Pirates, Jack," Fitzwilliam said, hand to his sword. "Your powers of observation never cease to amaze me," Jack said dryly. He narrowed his eyes, scanning the ship. Each pirate's flag had something unique about it. Jack grabbed the nobleman's expensive spyglass and put his eye to it. Maybe he could figure out which pirate he was dealing with by the look of its flag. The skull and crossbones has cross flowers below the skull. Just then, the captain came out to greet them. She strode up the deck, resting one boot on the base of the bowsprit. The pirate was magnificent, tall, beautiful, strong, every bit the perfect captain. And she had a fabulous hat. She drew a shiny, sharp sword. So did the 30 pirates behind her. Jack swallowed, but he refused to be intimidated by anyone. "Okay, lassie, make this quick," he called back. "We're kind of on a mission here with a bit of a tight schedule." "Watch your tongue, lad," the woman bellowed back, her long auburn locks whipped in the wind. "Know that you're at the mercy of Captain Laura Smith." "You know, it's funny," Jack whispered to Fitzwilliam. "She looks a little bit like—" "Mom!" Arabella cried, running forward. Your mother is dead, Fitzwilliam reminded her gently, killed by the notorious pirate Leftfoot Lewis. You must still be upset by our recent ordeal. This pirate only looks like your mother. This pirate, however, stared down the deck in shock. Twin sets of brown eyes locked on each other. Arabella? The captain called out, a catch in her voice. Aye, it's her, growled a pirate from behind her. With the shuffle that was feared across the Caribbean, Leftfoot Lewis stepped forward. The crew of the Barnacle gulped in shock. Lewis glared at Arabella and gestured toward her mother. And thanks to you, I must serve on her crew for eternity. The members of the Barnacle's crew stared at one another. Well, Jack said cheerfully, here we go again. And that is where this book ends. What a cliffhanger. So, as we've known from the past 4 books, Arabella's mom was presumed dead, killed by Leftfoot Lewis, as we found out in the pirate chase. And when Leftfoot Lewis disappeared at the end of that book, Arabella thought she had killed him, since she thought her mother was dead, and she used the words, may justice be done, and let it be done by her hand. But we find out that justice brought Lewis to Laura Smith's ship, and now he is doomed to serve on her crew forever. But we will learn more about Arabella's mom in the next book, which is book 6, named Silver. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this episode and the start of our next big adventure in the Young Jack Sparrow series. So we'll be covering Silver next time, of course, which is the next book, and it's definitely an exciting one. So I hope you'll join me then. But thank you so much for listening to this episode, and thank you to anyone who has taken time to rate or review the podcast wherever you listen to it. I know I sound like a broken record at this point, but it really does mean a lot to me. So thank you once again for listening, for rating, for reviewing, just being here and letting me talk about Pirates of the Caribbean for hours. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time for Book 6, Silver. Take care. Podcast of the Caribbean is in no way affiliated with Disney. If you want to send me an email or a question, you can send it over to podcastofthecaribbean@gmail.com. And you can also follow this podcast over on Instagram at Podcast of the Caribbean and on Twitter/X at PodcastPOTC. I post fun content and trivia over there, so make sure to check those platforms out. But be sure to keep a weather eye on the horizon, and always remember, dead men tell no tales.